Hello and Assalamu alaikum. I'm Marwa Mohkum Sheikh. Welcome to Narramus. So how did a drug trade deal lead to a full-scale war known as the First Opium War between two empires? By the start of the 19th century, trade in Chinese goods such as tea, silks, and porcelain was extremely lucrative for British merchants. However, the Chinese wouldn't take British products in return. They would only sell their goods in exchange for silver. As a result, Britain's silver reserves were being gradually depleted. To rectify this trade imbalance, the East India Company and other British merchants began to import Indian opium into China illegally, demanding payment in silver, which was then used to buy tea and other goods. By the late 1830s, the Chinese economy was bleeding silver due to the opium trade, while millions of citizens fell into addiction. The Qing government, alarmed and frustrated, decided to act. Officials in Canton, now Guangzhou, seized and destroyed over 20,000 chests of British opium and declared the death penalty for future smugglers. But the British government did not just support the merchants, they actively defended them. Why? Because opium was the most lucrative commodity in Britain's 19th century global trade network. When the Chinese crackdown threatened British profits, war became inevitable. Gunboats replaced diplomacy. The first shots of the war came in late 1839, when British HMS Voyage and HMS Hyacinth easily defeated 29 Chinese vessels. Then the British quickly moved north to the island of Chusan, and by July 5th had bombarded and captured the port city of Tinghai. In January 1841, the British targeted the Bogue forts, strategically positioned at the mouth of the Pearl River. On January 7th, they launched a successful assault, capturing the forts of Chuen Pi and Tai Kok To. Faced with overwhelming firepower and mounting losses, Chinese Admiral Quan Ti called for a truce. Just 11 days later, on January 18th, Hong Kong was ceded to Britain. In March 1841, British forces bombarded and captured several forts around the Canton. Then in May, a second offensive began. The British soldiers overran Canton. Then on August 26th, a massive naval and land operation was launched against the city of Amoy, modern-day Xiamen. Amoy's fall opened the door to even deeper incursions along the Chinese coastline. In early 1842, Major General Hugh Gough led 7,000 British troops in an assault on Ningbo, a strategic city in eastern China. The defenders resisted with determination, but by March 13th, the city fell. Then in May, the British captured Chapu. Meanwhile, in October 1841, the Battle of Qinghai had already revealed the vulnerability of the Qing coastal defenses. Despite 157 guns and nearly 9,000 defenders, British troops overran the fortress with minimal casualties. The final major battle of the First Opium War unfolded on July 21st at Xinjiang, present-day Zhenjiang. Xinjiang held critical strategic value. Located at the intersection of the Yangtze River and the Grand Canal, China's main route for grain transport and internal commerce. Nearly 7,000 British troops descended on the city. Street-to-street fighting turned bloody. Chinese resistance was fierce, but by the end of the battle, Xinjiang had fallen. So the Daoguang Emperor, faced with the reality of defeat and fearing further humiliation, finally sued for peace. The Treaty of Nanking, signed in August 1842, officially ended the First Opium War, but peace came at a steep price for China. Under the treaty's terms, the Qing Empire paid a massive indemnity, ceded Hong Kong Island to Britain, and opened 5 major ports for British trade and residence. It also granted British subjects legal immunity in Chinese territory. The treaty shattered the old Canton system, exposed the weakness of the Qing state, and set a precedent for future foreign exploitation. In fact, it became the first in a series of so-called unequal treaties that would haunt China for decades. Militarily, the First Opium War was a lesson in contrast. The technological gap between the two sides was staggering. British naval superiority was undeniable. Steam-powered, iron-hulled ships like the HMS Nemesis could navigate rivers and coastlines with ease, with or without wind. Qing forces, by contrast, relied on wooden, sail-powered junks which were slow, poorly maneuverable, and highly vulnerable. British warships fired explosive shells over 1,000 meters using advanced cannons like the Paixhan's gun, reloading in minutes. Qing cannons were limited in range, slow to reload, and often fixed in place. On land, British soldiers carried reliable brown Bess muskets, deadly in coordinated volleys. Most Qing troops, however, wielded outdated matchlocks or even swords and spears, and only about a third had firearms. Communication and logistics had the same asymmetry. The British used semaphore signals, telescopes, and precise navigation tools, backed by supply lines from India and disciplined coordination, whereas the Qing soldiers relied on flags and lanterns with no standardized system. Doctrine and battlefield strategy were equally mismatched. British infantry fought with discipline and precision. They formed tight lines, fired in volleys, and maneuvered in lockstep. Controlled skirmish lines and bayonet charges allowed them to concentrate force exactly where it counted. Qing infantry, by contrast, followed a mixed and often outdated approach. Some units fired muskets, but many still used bows, spears, and swords. At sea, doctrine made all the difference. British warships unleashed devastating broadsides, enforced naval blockades, and used steam power to bypass static defenses and strong points. Whereas Qing naval strategy relied on massed war junks and against steam-driven mobility, they were easily flanked and overwhelmed. The Qing defenses were heavy but brittle. Coastal forts like those at Human, known as Baka Tigris, bristled with cannons, but their fire wasn't coordinated. Bannermen defended the river mouths, yet without mobility or modern doctrine, they were sitting targets for British gunboats. On the battlefield, the British dominated with mobility, coordination, and shock power. At Chuen Pi in 1839 and again in 1841, British steam frigates shelled Chinese positions with pinpoint accuracy before launching amphibious assaults. To it, Qing war junks and coastal forts crumbled under long-range fire. As mentioned earlier, in May 1841, the British stormed Canton, wherein the naval bombardments cleared the path for infantry landings. Then came the inland offensive. At Chinkiang in July 1842, over 160 miles upriver, British troops fired Congreve rockets into the city's defenses before launching a full-scale assault. Amphibious mastery became Britain's signature. Steam power let them hit one city, then pivot to the next before Qing forces could react. Flexibility was their greatest weapon. The Qing tried to fight back, sending fire rafts, launching guerrilla raids near blockades, ambushing river patrols. But against ironclads and trained riflemen, these tactics had little effect. Fire ships were destroyed before making contact. Raids couldn't stop the fall of key ports. The casualty numbers tell the same story. British casualties were just 520 in total, 69 killed and 451 wounded. Qing military losses were 19,000 to 20,000, whereas Chinese civilian deaths were estimated at 15,000, especially in bombarded cities and occupied zones. British firepower, medicine, and logistics kept their toll low. For the Qing and their people, the cost was catastrophic. In short, British forces were smaller but faster, better trained, and far more technologically advanced. The Qing military was outdated and decentralized. That realization during the First Opium War prompted China's long, painful journey towards military modernization, a path that still shapes its military advancement today. Is China's military strategy in the 21st century still driven by the deep scars of 19th century humiliation? What do you think? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, Allah Hafiz.